Britain once ruled the biggest empire in human history. At its peak, it spanned a quarter of the globe and ruled over hundreds of millions of people. For some, the empire remains a symbol of national pride. But in recent years, there has been a resurgence of criticism of the empire across the Caribbean, Africa, Asia, and in Britain itself.
And we demand an apology and reparations.
Critics say the empire was built on racial discrimination, stolen land, and the mass murder and enslavement of millions. So, who gets to tell the story of Britain's empire? And should Britain have a reckoning with its sordid imperial past? My guest tonight is Emeritus Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology at Oxford University, Nigel Biggar. He argues that the critics of the British Empire overstate its vices while ignoring its many virtues. I'm Mehdi Hasan, and tonight I'll go head-to-head with Nigel Biggar, a Conservative peer. I'll challenge him on his defence of empire and colonialism and his arguments against reparations for slavery. Tonight, I will also be joined by three experts. Gurminder, Bhambra, Professor of Historical Sociology in the Department of International Relations at the University of Sussex. Kojo, Professor of Law and History at the University of Loughborough. And Lawrence Goldman, Fellow and Tutor in Modern History at St. Peter's College, Oxford University. Nigel Biggar, thank you so much for joining us on Head to Head tonight. The British Empire was the biggest in history, and under the empire, millions died in famines from Ireland to India, in massacres from Malaya to Kenya, in concentration camps in South Africa. The list goes on and on, as you know better than me. But you say you felt compelled as an ethicist, not as a historian, to write your book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning, because you say there is, quote, a fairer, more positive story to be told about the British Empire than the anti-colonialists want us to hear. Briefly, just to kick us off, what is that story?
So the first thing to say, Mehdi, is that empire and slavery and racism are universal phenomena, practiced on every continent by people of every skin color. You can't find any 400-year long state, such as the British Empire was, that doesn't contain very bad stuff, and you've listed some of them there. But the British Empire chalked up some major liberal and humanitarian achievements that I don't want us to forget. For example, the British were among the first peoples in the history of the world to abolish slavery, then used imperial power for a century and a half to suppress slavery from Brazil to New Zealand. The British Empire also committed itself to fighting the massively murderous genocidal regime in Nazi Berlin in 1939, and for 12 months between May 1940 and June 41, the empire offered Nazi Germany the only military resistance, with the sole exception of Greece, and the empire has produced, according to the World Values Survey 2023, three of the least racist countries on earth: Britain, Australia, and Canada, in sharp contrast to Russia, China, and Iran.
In your book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning, you list various motivations you say drove the British Empire, like the lure of adventure, a desire to make peace and establish self-government. You say there's nothing wrong with these innocent, in some cases you say admirable intentions. I do wonder though, for example, did Cecil Rhodes, the British colonial founder of Rhodesia, did he have good intentions when he said he preferred African land to Africans, who he called the N-word, and when he wrote, Africa is still lying ready for us, it is our duty to take more territory. More territory simply means more of the Anglo-Saxon race, more of the best, the most human, the most honorable race the world possesses.
Yeah. So I don't defend Cecil Rhodes. I wouldn't present him as a poster boy of the British Empire.
You have defended him.
Well, partial defense. He wasn't South Africa's Hitler. He didn't commit genocide in South Africa. Was he racist? If he was a racist who opposed the removal of the vote from black South Africans in Cape Colony, and his famous Rhodes scholarships. In his will, he made clear these scholarships were to be granted regardless of race.
People disagree about what he meant by that.
But within 4 years of his death, the first African-American Rhodes Scholar was appointed. Rhodes, I've made quite clear, Rhodes is a mixed bag. He wasn't a saint, but he wasn't a devil. He was a buccaneer.
It's a very general assessment, though, of a man who's considered to be a kind of deeply dishonorable person in the way he led his life and the way he had. When you say he wasn't a saint and wasn't a sinner, wasn't a devil, I mean, that could apply to anyone in this room. And people in this room haven't said ridiculous things about natives should be subjected to British rule.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very soft assessment. I mean, we wouldn't say that about other dictators, tyrants, killers throughout history.
No, of course.
And you take this approach to a lot of colonial leaders.
In Rhodes's case, I'm responding to the kinds of things that those who are clamouring for Rhodes's statue in Oxford to fall. South Africa's Hitler, guilty of genocide, white supremacist. None of those things are simply true. There are elements of truth in them, but not simply true. So I do defend Rhodes, but it's a critical defence.
It's a weird defence, though. It's a defence to say, you said twice now, he's not South Africa's Hitler. Yeah. You mentioned the Nazis a couple of times.
Well, that's because his critics do.
But in the book, I think about a dozen times, you said the British Empire was not Nazi Germany, which I'm not going to argue with you tonight about.
No, but many do.
Many do, but it's a very low bar to say we were not the Nazis, right? As a moral philosopher, I'm sure you understand that point.
I get that.
And I would also add, by the way, the Nazis themselves were fans of the British Empire, as you know. I mean, Hitler said we should learn from the English. Yep. Hitler said he had sincere admiration for the immeasurable colonizing work of the British Empire. Not a great endorsement, I would say.
No, indeed. Let me just make clear what the appeal to Nazism, what part it plays in the argument against the British Empire. The argument against the British Empire is, if you look through history, it contained both good and bad, okay? But what the critics say is, well, it doesn't matter how many bridges the British built in India or canals they developed, whatever. It was essentially racist, essentially genocidal, in the same way that it doesn't matter the fact that Hitler had a hand in developing the Volkswagen or whatever. Auschwitz, there's no compensation for Auschwitz. And all I'm saying is, okay, the British Empire did contain both good and bad, but there was nothing akin to the massively racist, genocidal intent of Berlin.
But as a moral philosopher and theologian, you would agree that not being the Nazis shouldn't be the bar. Right, you can be an evil empire and still not be the Nazis. But Saddam Hussein could say, yeah, I gassed the Kurds, but I'm not Hitler. We would still say Saddam was an evil man.
The point is, the argument made by the critics is, the British Empire was essentially evil, and I say, no, it wasn't essentially evil. It was a mixture of good and bad. There were elements of racism.
I think that's a straw man. A lot of historians of empire do not say essentially evil. They point out the sheer quantity of evil they've done that we don't talk about, Nigel. You teach at Oxford. I studied at Oxford. I went to school in the UK. I think people in this audience in London would agree. In this country, you're taught about the Tudors and the Nazis. I can tell you about how many wives Henry VIII had. I was not taught about the Mau Mau massacre. I was not taught about the Amritsar massacre. I was not taught about British concentration camps in South Africa. It's actually the opposite of what you're saying. We've actually covered up our rather sordid and evil imperial past.
I don't think that's fair. I mean, for God's sake,
you think most British people know about all those massacres I just mentioned to you?
No, but most British people know barely any history at all. For example, if we learn about the 150 years, mainly 150 years, in which some British people were involved in enslaving Africans, that's fine. Can we also hear about the abolition movement, and the 150 years
I promise that tonight we're going to talk about slavery.
Yeah.
Right now, just on Rhodes, it's interesting you said he's not South Africa's Hitler. Hitler was a fan of Rhodes, the man you're saying is a mixed man. Goebbels praised him by name.
Maybe Hitler was a fan of Mozart. That doesn't make Mozart bad.
No, but maybe he was a fan of Mozart. Well, it's a great line, but let's just think that through. Maybe he was a fan of Mozart for his music, and maybe he was a fan of Rhodes for being an imperialist who killed non-white people.
It's not clear to me, maybe, what that says about Rhodes. I mean, Hitler's view.
He's a pretty bad guy, I would say. I mean, the problem you have, Nigel, is this is what you do in the book. You say I'm looking at good and evil, but when you look at a lot of colonial leaders, you present them in the best possible light. Let me give you an example. And people accuse you of cherry picking. You know this because you've responded to your critics at length in the book. For example, you praise a colonial leader like the first Marquis of Hastings, who was Governor General of India. And you quote him saying that he wanted to promote the, quote, happiness of the vast population of the country. And you praise him for saying that. Great line. That's a quote from his diary, which you quote from. In that same diary, he says that Hindus in India are limited to, quote, mere animal functions with no higher intellect than a dog might be supposed to capable of attaining. Strange that you didn't include that quote in your book.
I didn't include that quote, but you can find other quotes similar to it, so I don't deny...
I mean, it completely undermines the idea of the Marquis of Hastings as some great believer in egalitarianism and racial equality.
Not entirely, Mehdi, because most of us are moral mixtures and we're not consistent. I don't condone the stuff you've just read out from his diary, people can read the book and find that I quote other people saying equally abhorrent racist things. My argument is, yes, the British Empire contained racism, as does any human society. And let's be clear here, racism was not an invention of the British or Europeans. Lots of Africans have racist views of other Africans. Medieval Arabs had racist views of both Europeans and Africans. Gandhi was disparaging about Africans. So let's be clear, racism is not a peculiarly British thing, it's abhorrent. And my point is, racism was not... You cannot say that the British Empire was essentially racist, because there were also anti-racist impulses as well. And the whole of the abolition movement, which became widely popular in this country in the late 1700s, was premised on the basic equality of all people under God, regardless of race. And
I mean, you're defending the empire by citing a lot of anti-imperialists, but as I say, we'll come to slavery. Just on colonialism and racism, you mentioned again, you said lots of other societies were racist. Gandhi was racist. Africans were racist. First of all, we're talking about the British Empire. So that's one issue.
Yes, but let's put that in context.
But you're a moral theologian. So you're supposed to describe actions and judge actions objectively, independently. The whataboutism is something you find on the playground. Well, miss, I hit him, but he hit me, and that kid hit that kid.
Okay.
If you're evaluating whether the British Empire was good or evil, you should evaluate on its merits.
No,
other people...
I'm quite clear that racism, from whatever quarter, is morally wrong. What I'm against is picking out the British and saying these people were
the British, we had the biggest empire in
extraordinarily racist, because it isn't true.
I mean, you're using straw man arguments. Extraordinary race, I don't know what that metric is, but we had the biggest empire in the world. We were involved in the slave trade. We conquered countries like multiple countries across the world, ran them almost as dictatorships. And the colonial leaders did speak in racist terms. I've only quoted 2. We could quote about 20 more. There is a lot of whataboutism in the book, Nigel. You seem to justify...
What's wrong with whataboutism?
What is wrong with whataboutism?
Yeah.
Well, I'll give you an example. You say, for example, the first Opium War, in which the British killed thousands of Chinese people. You say that war was wrong. You say in the book, you say it was wrong, it was unjust. But then you add straight away, in just a couple of lines later, that those Chinese deaths at the hands of the British in the 19th century, and I quote you, fade into insignificance when compared to the millions killed by Mao in China a century later. What has one got to do with the other? Mao killing Chinese people in the 20th century doesn't make it okay for the British to kill Chinese people in the 19th century. How is that a moral assessment?
The connection is this. The communist government in China uses the period when European powers and British powers were exploiting China to excite Chinese nationalism. And the communist government in Beijing completely ignores the fact that Mao presided over the deaths of Chinese on a much larger scale.
That's not a moral point, though. So why did you add the caveat? It pales into insignificance compared to Mao.
To make clear, Mehdi, that this was not extraordinary.
But that's not what morality is about. I mean, Nigel, it's not just China. I mean, throughout the book, I read this book, throughout the book, you kind of go halfway there, and then you can't help yourself. You say, the British Empire was bad, but it wasn't the Nazis. The first Opium War was bad, but Mao was worse. You say famines happened in India under the Imperial watch, but the famines happened after independence too. You say the camps in Kenya were bad, but then you say, but the Soviet gulags were worse. You do that throughout the book. You can't bring yourself to just say, this was really bad. As a Briton, I'm saying this was bad.
Well,
why can't you do that? Can you do it tonight?
Page 276, you will find a whole list of the bad things over which the British Empire presided.
I'm chuckling because I had a feeling that you were going to say page 276, because you wrote a postscript, and every time someone criticizes you, say, look at page 276. It's like your one page out of 400 pages where you list all the crimes, and it's your go-to move to say page 276.
Because page 276 summarizes what the previous 250 pages have said. It's not just the only place.
So can you do it tonight? Can you criticize something the British Empire did as evil without any qualification, caveat, if, but, what about?
Slavery. Disproportionate violence, sometimes the theft of land, The most destructive thing probably was the spread of disease, which was inadvertent.
You just did it. You just did it. You just did it in front of our eyes.
Well, tell me, the COVID epidemic killed 7 million people.
Okay.
It originated in China.
Okay.
Did the Chinese intend to kill 7 million people?
You've literally just made my point for me. Why are we talking about COVID? You couldn't bring yourself to just say it was really bad what the British Empire did.
The point has to do with the moral quality of an act depends on intention. There are lots of things we do that have bad effects. So
I agree with you on that. We agree.
So Europeans brought diseases to North America and Australia, as did Indonesian fishermen from Indonesia to northern Australia, which had devastating effects on native peoples. No one intended to do it. No one can be blamed for it.
I agree with you on intent. But when you carry out a massacre, like in Amritsar, that's intent. When you carry out torture in Kenya and you say we're going to do this quietly, that's intent.
As I admit in the book.
Okay, good. So we can condemn what happened in Kenya as an evil stain on British history as part of the empire.
Well, it depends what you mean, but the
torture of people in the Bhambra.
The clubbing to death of 11 detainees by African warders at Hola Camp, yes, was very bad, and the authorities are responsible for that. Yep.
Great. I love it when we agree. In the conclusion of your book, Colonialism: A Moral Reckoning, you offer your readers a tally of the evils of British colonialism, as well as a, of course, credit column in the British Imperial Ledger. Basically,
why do you say of course?
I'll tell you why.
You seem to be sceptical.
I am, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
You summarize the pros and cons, the good and the evil, and then you say you're not keeping score. You say very explicitly, is that still the case, that you're not scoring them?
I don't say that.
You say, where's it gone? Let me just pull up the exact quote. You say, whatever the debit column of British colonialism, there's a credit column too, of which any fair ethical assessment must take into account the goods and evils that the empire caused, intentionally or not, of such different kinds that they cannot be measured against one another.
The different keeping score. So I keep score, but I say you can't weigh these up.
You can't say one's longer or better than the other.
Tell me how.
Is that your position?
Tell me how.
No, I'm asking the question.
Can't be done.
It can't be done. So then why did you go on a right-wing podcast and say that the credit column is longer?
Because on the page it is. Because on the page it is. Let me be clear. On the page there's a longer list of the good stuff. On the matter of whether you can weigh these things up, you can't do it.
So you were just talking about the physical pages that take it up. You weren't trying to imply on a right-wing podcast in 2023 that the credit column is longer for the British Empire.
Why is it relevant? The podcast was right-wing. What's it got to do with anything?
Oh, I think because you were talking to a host who was much more in agreement with you, and you were much more honest about what your actual view is, which is you think the British Empire did more good than evil.
No, I didn't say that. You have... I've made it perfectly clear. I don't think you can weigh up goods and evils in that fashion. Okay. So the point you were making is actually beside the point.
Even if we accept that the column is longer, and you're saying you don't think it's longer, you were talking about number of pages.
It was longer physically on the page.
Physically, you were talking physically, okay. But let me get to my question. How does that morally justify any of the evil side of the column?
It doesn't.
It doesn't, right?
Well, but name me, okay, it doesn't, no, it doesn't justify it. But name me any state, as I say, any long-standing state, that doesn't preside over bad stuff.
But isn't that a problem then, as a moral philosophy?
Yeah, well,
like, how do we judge the evil people in history? They'll all come up with some defense of some good thing they did.
No.
Or do we just give the British Empire that pass?
No, we don't. I don't give it that pass. What I say is, the empire contained both these things, different times.
I mean, the millions of people died because of the British Empire, under the rule of the British Empire, over the course of hundreds of years. Yeah, so I can say that is a great evil, just as I can look at the Nazis and say millions of people died in Nazis. Now, we can play pedantry around who was essentially racist or not, but in terms of killing people, the British Empire killed a lot of innocent people, and many of us would argue that should be a bigger source of shame and focus than the fact that, yes, they built railway stations. It only matters whether the British Empire did good or evil in its own terms. You have to pick, are you a historian or are you an ethicist? Because you keep jumping around.
I'm a bit of both.
Okay.
So my view is that the British Empire presided over both good and evil, and I do the best I can at the end, and I explain what my overall argument is.
Let's go to our panel of experts who've been waiting patiently here. Gurminder Bhambra is a professor of historical sociology at the Department of International Relations, the University of Sussex, editor of the forthcoming book, The Modern World After Colonialism. Gurminder, you've read Nigel's book, I know. In his introduction, he does say he sets out to paint a historically accurate and fairer picture of the British Empire. Did he do it in your view?
Not in my view, no.
What's your central objection to what you've heard from Nigel tonight?
Well, I think one of the first things we have to take issue with is the way in which Nigel constructs the very idea of empire, and this argument that he makes that empires have existed across human societies, across all time, and that all empires are effectively the same sort of phenomenon. And I would argue that we need to think about empires quite differently. There is a significant difference between empires of incorporation, which included empires such as the Ottoman, the Chinese, the Mughal, and European empires of extraction, which were effectively the British, the French, and the Dutch. And one of the ways in which we can think about the differences between the two is the way in which they relate to questions of food scarcity that occur, because food scarcity occurs across all human societies at different times. The British Empire, and if we compare it with the Mughal Empire, because it's the same territory, the same populations, there was no significant famine that created death under the Mughal Empire, which ruled for over 400 years. Under the British Empire within India, when the East India Company came into power, they presided over a famine in Bengal which killed over 10 million people out of a population of 30 million, and they collected more taxes at the same time. There had never been a famine under Mughal rule within Bengal, and the next time there was a significant famine in Bengal was when the British government were directly in control during the Second World War, where 3 million died.
Okay. Let me bring in Lawrence Goldman, who is a fellow and tutor in modern history at St. Peter's College, Oxford, former editor of the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. Lawrence, how do you respond to what you've heard tonight?
Well, I'm fascinated by the moralism that you show, Mehdi, and that I think the audience shows, because I don't think moralism has a place in these arguments, if I may say so. If you read history as a record of whether people are just or evil, you're not doing anything at all. You're certainly not reading history. You're imposing upon the complexity of human civilization not only the wrong categories, because every society, every civilization is evil in some ways and good in others. And you're also, if I may say so, you are projecting onto the past your own contemporary morality. If you think about racism for a moment, most of human history has been dominated by people who have thought in racial terms, who have divided the world and the peoples that they governed according to their races. It is absolutely ubiquitous. It is absolutely normal. And we, of course, because we now live in anti-racist societies, we are simply projecting onto the past. They would not understand us, Mehdi. It would be completely ahistorical. So I ask the audience to think historically and not moralistically.
So the problem, Lawrence, is that Nigel specifically wrote a book saying he wanted to make a moral assessment of empire. So if you have a problem with the morality side of things, you should take it up with Nigel, not me. That was the goal of the book. In terms of what you said about projecting onto the past, I hear that argument a lot, and I take your point about racism and where cultural attitudes go. But killing lots of people, I'm pretty sure they thought that was wrong in 1850, 1750, 1650. Murdering and massacring women and children, I think they thought that was wrong at the time as well.
But isn't it remarkable in the history of the British Empire that at a certain point in the 19th century, they began to think rather differently about the use of violence. And they wanted, for example...
Weird because they set up concentration camps in South Africa straight after that.
Perhaps, but what they wanted to do was trade. Now, the British Empire, as you present it, is one long exercise in the same thing. But as a historian, I put it to you that it's not. A free trade empire in the 19th century is really about commercial intertrade.
So let me bring in Kojo Koram, who's a professor of law and history at the University of Loughborough, author of Uncommon Wealth, Britain and the Aftermath of Empire. Nigel says many of the intentions behind the people setting up the empire were admirable in some ways. People wanted to establish self-government, he says. You just heard Lawrence say a free trade empire. What is wrong with that view of the empire, in your opinion?
Well, I think what we need to do is actually look at what was said by some of the people who set up the empire. And what's really fortunate about the British Empire is so much of the heavy lifting of empire wasn't done by the British state, but was actually done by a number of private chartered companies. And what you can see in their charters is their objective for why they started the extraction of wealth in those countries, and that is to maximize profits for their shareholders. Whether they introduced some cultural practices or played a little football with the natives as part of that project is not the objective of these institutions. We can look at the historical conversation that happened, not subsequently rewriting history, but at the time. Look at the words of so say if I said to you at the moment the idea that the colonization of the Caribbean was the great source of wealth and power in Britain, you might think that that's been written by a C.L.R. James or an Eric Williams or a Walter Rodney. No, that's Edmund Burke, the father of English conservatism. Until very recently, it was common sense that the British Empire gained most of its wealth from the colonization of the colonies, and it's in fact a lot of the revisionism that thing is being done right now.
Nigel, do you want to respond to Kojo or Gurminder? He says revisionism.
Let me just start with Kojo, since that's fresh in my mind. So Kojo, on that last point, you're quite right. I mean, there are some economic historians who reckon that the contribution of slave trading and slavery to Britain's industrialization was, I think Eric Williams said, enormous. Others say central. Most economic historians that I know about say no, it was somewhere between small and modest. The greatest living historian of transatlantic slavery, David Eltis, and I say that because Henry Gates, the African-American historian at Harvard, rates Eltis as the most authoritative. He uses the word trivial in terms of the contribution of slave trading and slavery. So one thing we need to make clear on that issue, anyone who makes an unqualified claim that slave trading and slavery made an enormous or central contribution to British industrial prosperity is not telling the whole truth, because that is highly controversial.
Okay, as I mentioned earlier, we are going to talk slavery after the break. Do you want to deal with Gurminder's point about you treat all empires the same, and the British Empire in many ways was worse than other empires?
Well, I know that empire took different forms. I don't accept the simple description of British Empire as extractive, partly because the population of India during British rule increased by almost 3 times, which implies some level of increasing prosperity. The area of cultivatable land in India increased 8 times under the British. So I don't deny there were instances of exploitation and extraction, but to characterize the whole of the empire in those terms is simply wrong, because the empire gave indigenous peoples opportunities they'd never had.
Just to clarify, I mean, you mentioned the population. There is also studies done. Journal World Development did a study that between 1890 and 1920, there were 50 million excess deaths in India. We will continue this discussion. There's more to go. We've mentioned slavery a few times tonight. We will go back to our panel. We will hear more from Nigel in part 2 of Head to Head when we come back with Nigel Biggar to talk about his other book, Reparations, Slavery, and the Tyranny of Imaginary Guilt. Don't go away. Welcome back to Head on Al Jazeera. My guest tonight is Nigel Biggar, moral theologian, conservative peer, author of the book Reparations, Slavery, and the Tyranny of Imaginary Guilt. Nigel, first half we talked about colonialism and empire in your first book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. Let's talk about slavery, which you write about in your colonialism book. You also write about in your book this year, Reparations. You've said slavery has come in a variety of forms throughout history. It's existed since time immemorial. You say, quote, "It is obvious that slavery is wrong." But then you go on to say in the same paragraph that there could be good and bad forms of it. Can you tell the audience here what a good form of slavery is?
Well, for example, domestic slavery in the Islamic world was a lot less inhumane than chattel slavery on the sugar plantations of the West Indies, as I'm sure you'd agree. And in the Islamic world, some slaves could rise to very high positions of political power. So even though I think all slavery in which human beings are the property of someone else and have no rights whatsoever is wrong for that reason, nevertheless, that can take different forms, some of which are a lot less inhumane.
So what you meant to say is there are less worse forms. There are no good forms of slavery, because you used the word good, and that jumped out to me. As a moral philosopher, you would say there's no such thing as a good slavery.
I make perfectly clear I think slavery as such is wrong for the reason I've said. So yes, less worse.
By the way, I noticed you mentioned in the book, and you just said a moment ago, Islamic slavery. And yet, throughout the books, both books, I never see you refer to what the British or the Portuguese did as Christian slavery.
Yeah.
Why?
So the use of the word Islamic there is not referring to religion as such, it's referring to a culture. I could have said Arab, but I'm not quite clear whether there were, as it were, Muslim peoples who were involved in slavery who weren't Arab. So I use either term.
But you would be happy to use the phrase Christian slavery?
Yes, I would.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, I would.
You've argued in your book, Reparations, Slavery and the Tyranny of Imaginary Guilt, that Britain has already essentially paid penance for slavery by abolishing it and later fighting against the slave trade. Putting aside the arguments around practicality and logistics, how you would do reparations, can we park that for a moment? As an ethicist, do you even believe there is a moral case still for Britain to offer some form of reparations for its big role in the slave trade?
No.
Why?
Several reasons. First of all, as I say, slavery was a universal institution. Secondly, lots of peoples were involved in the transatlantic slave trade, not least Africans. So if we're going to have, as it were, an accounting of who owes what, then the African nations need to be taken into account as well. Third, the British were among the first peoples in the history of the world to abolish both the trade and the institution, then spent both money and lives suppressing it worldwide. Does that make up for what was done to the millions of African slaves in the West Indies or the Southern American colonies? No, it doesn't. There's no way we can. I mean, those people are dead. The best the British could do was to stop it and then to try and stop other people engaging in it.
I just want to unpack, because you said a couple of points there. In terms of the African countries, we talked about this in part one. That is whataboutism. From a moral point of view, whether Britain should offer some form of reparations or apology for slavery is irrelevant what other people do.
No, it's not.
You're responsible for your own actions.
No, it's not.
Why?
It's not. By all means, Britain should acknowledge responsibility for that. So should African countries, and they don't.
That's not true.
It's a matter of fairness.
That's not true.
It's a matter of fairness.
That's not true.
The African Union...
Benin...
The African Union...
Hold on. You said African countries have not. That is factually untrue.
Comprising lots of African
Well, we're not in the European Union, as people know anymore, so let's forget about unions.
The African Union...
Well, we're not in the EU.
A few weeks ago had said that it plans to submit a bill to Britain for reparations for slavery.
Great.
When lots of African countries, especially in West Africa, were involved in it.
You're not dealing with the central point, which is you said African countries have not apologized or not involved in some form of reparations. Uganda and Benin have both formally apologized. Why can't we follow them and do the same?
Apologize. Okay.
They filed a formal state apology. Why can't the British government do it?
Because we apologized 200 years ago by stopping it and suppressing it.
That's not an apology.
It's much more than an apology.
Nigel, you are a professor.
Much more than
you
an
are
apology.
a professor of moral theology. And when I hear you speak, if I went out, if me and all my neighbors killed everyone in the local area, hold on, let me finish my analogy. Okay. Let's pretend that I'm your student in class. I'm making my pitch to you as a professor. If me and all my friends killed everyone in the local area, we constantly killed and kidnapped people in the local area, and then I stopped doing it, and I then made all my neighbors stop doing it, you're telling me that any kind of justice for the people I killed or kidnapped, that they've had any kind of accountability, that I've made up for what I did just by stopping doing it. Stopping committing a crime, you don't get a prize for stopping committing a crime.
Well, okay.
You tell me, where am I wrong? Morally, where am I wrong?
I think if you're among the first peoples in the history of the world to stop doing something that is very common, I think you should get some credit for that, especially if it cost you. And I think you should also get credit for spending a century and a half suppressing it from Brazil to New Zealand at cost. Can you make up for what happened to those people then? No, you can't. Can we make up for what happened to the medieval serfs who were exploited, or the early industrial workers who were stopped? No, we can't.
Hold on. We did lose people, as you say. You keep mentioning the cost. Several hundred, some say more than 1,000 British sailors were involved in sacrificed their lives, and that is undeniably true. 3 million slaves were taken by the British Empire across the Atlantic. 300,000 of them or more died just crossing over the Atlantic. Whatever we did to cancel it out pales into insignificance with the original crime. And when you talk about, we can't do anything about it, they're already dead. Funny that we managed to find £20 million at the time, which was equivalent to 40% of the government budget, to compensate the slave owners. We compensated the slave owners, but not the slaves or the victims of slavery.
And the reason for
How is that not a huge moral wrong, morally?
No, it wasn't morally wrong, partly because that was required, to get abolition through the British Parliament. Had it not been
that's Nigel Biggar, the Conservative peer, speaking. That's a politician. That is not a moral assessment.
Well,
morally, that's irrelevant. What was needed to go through Parliament?
No, Mehdi, no. If you want to get slavery abolished, that was the political cost. And if you don't pay that cost, then slavery gets extended. I think that was a morally justifiable political compromise. The other reason for paying compensation to the owners of slaves was to enable sugar plantations to remain viable businesses after abolition. Why? Yes, of course, so that investors could continue to make a profit, but also so that emancipated slaves would have some means of earning a wage.
So why can't people today, in the Caribbean, for example, the CARICOM, as you know, the Association of Caribbean States, they're asking for, you know what their #1 request is in their 10-point list of reparations? A formal apology. That costs us nothing. Why can't we do that?
Well, if you think a formal apology is more important than the actual process of abolition and the process of worldwide suppression, if you think that's more important, then I guess we could say the words.
These false binaries now. Who's saying that that's not important? We're saying that's not enough, as you yourself agreed.
I guess what I'm saying is I think the act was a costly apology. But you want the words added? I'm sure we could add the words.
But they haven't. The British government has refused to do that. In fact, it tried to block the EU from doing it earlier. Let's go to our panel of experts who are waiting here to come in. Kojo, Nigel says it's just not possible. It wasn't possible then. It's not possible now. This isn't an issue of morality, or if it is, it's about getting slavery ended. We paid the price to the slave owners. What's wrong with that view?
I think that we always try to frame the idea of reparations as though it's an impossibility, when in fact we see it pretty prevalent within both international and transnational justice movements of the current moment. We can look at not just the German reparations paid towards victims of the Holocaust, we can look at the German paying reparations to the victims of the genocide in modern-day Namibia. And we understand the mechanisms that could allow for that ability to transfer resources over time to people who have been the long-term victims. If we could do that with the compensation of the enslavers with the Slave Compensation Act in 1837, which comes after the Emancipation Act in 1834, then we absolutely have the technology to be able to do that in the current day.
Lawrence Goldman, do you disagree with that?
3 points. One, in 1832-33, a Whig cabinet had to push for emancipation. And the slaveholders in the Caribbean set the price at 40 million. 40 million was what they wanted. And the Whigs beat them down to 20 million. Now, it was not controversial. If you look at political records, if you look at the correspondence, nobody thought it was controversial at all. That was the price that had to be paid, and the British were prepared. Their government was prepared.
Got it.
It's a deal.
Points 2 and 3. Time is short.
Okay. Simply, again, to keep morality out of this, because sometimes you just have to do things which are painful, but not in a moral framework. But secondly, let's think about apologies for a moment, and let me be a moralist for a second.
Okay.
What would be the validity of an apology by people who've nothing to do with slavery, who live generations after it ended, who live in a multicultural society where tens of millions of us were not even here? What are we apologizing for? Something that we never did. And who are we apologizing to? People who were never slaves. It would be empty. It would have no significance. Okay. It would destroy the idea of an apology.
It's a very common and strong argument. I'm going to interrupt you before we get to point 3 and say, Kojo, do you want to respond to that point?
I think that when we talk about what would be the value of acknowledging the violence of transatlantic slavery and also of trying to make reparative justice, we are thinking about what happens in the present, not just in the past. I think that in the moment of a changing world in which we have a growing multipolarity, Britain is looking to try and re-establish its relationships with its former colonial countries in the Commonwealth. Of course, that problem emerged when it turned out that the Foreign Office had codenamed that trade strategy Empire 2.0. And so this is part of the myopia that happens when we try to extend ourselves into the currently changing world without acknowledging the violence and the pain of people we are then trying to facilitate trade relationships with.
Let me bring in Gurminder Bhambra, who's been waiting patiently. Gurminder, Nigel makes the point that empire is part of human history. We talked about this earlier. He also makes the point that slavery is part of human history. He mentioned, quote unquote, Islamic slavery and other forms of slavery. What's your response to that? What would you say?
I mean, well, I think there's a real issue about the lack of specificity about what is being talked about. It is just not true that all societies had forms of slavery that were equivalent in any way. What emerges with the European trade in human beings is a very distinct form of slavery which involves the transaction of human beings. So you have forms of servitude and you have forms of coerced labor in societies where there weren't previously ideas of free labor. What's distinct about the emergence of chattel slavery as the Europeans undertake it is that what's happening in Europe at the time is the emergence of the idea of free labor. So to have free labor at home, but to kidnap and enslave populations elsewhere and to transact them, and that's a very distinct form from any other type of serfdom, servitude, or forms of bondage that exist in any other part of the world.
Nigel.
So I fully accept that there were different forms of slavery. I need to ponder what you've said, quite understand the significance of it. What I don't accept is that the form of enslavement that the Europeans engaged in was uniquely brutal. It was very brutal, it wasn't uniquely so. In terms of reparations, to finger the British alone, and it's only the British or Europeans who are being fingered, is just unfair, given the fact that we abolished it, we suppressed it, we paid for that, and that no one is asking money from Africa. And West Africans were involved in enslaving other Africans, at least from the 1500s onwards.
Very briefly, you want to comment?
The abolition of slavery was followed by a century or more of indenture. So it's not as if abolition was the end of the story. So we often talk about abolition as if it's the end of the story of European involvement in the enslavement of populations. Not only do we not talk about enslavement within the Indian Ocean world, but only focus on transatlantic slavery, but we also don't then look at the systems of indenture that took millions of Indians and Chinese to the Caribbean. Indenture is not different to enslavement.
Morally speaking, indenture and slavery are not the same thing.
Just on slavery, though, before I do want to go to the audience, you could have written a book and said, I think that we did a great job ending slavery, which we did. But I don't know if this is just because it helps you become a bestseller, but you add this line, the tyranny of imaginary guilt. You're a Christian theologian, and you're saying we shouldn't feel guilty at all about 3 million Africans being taken out of their homes and moved to across the Atlantic? The guilt is imaginary? Why can't we have guilt and also believe everything you just said?
First of all, we can only feel guilt for something we did.
We did. We did take 3 million people out of Africa.
You and I didn't. No, you and I didn't. I can lament what some of our ancestors did. I can't feel guilty for it.
So that means you take... So hold on. So you're telling me with a straight face you don't take pride in Britain, in us defeating the Nazis in World War II? You've never taken pride in that?
I take pride in it. I admire the fact of what
How can you take pride in it? It's not us.
Well, no, of course. I can't claim the credit for having done that because I didn't. My parents did. I didn't.
We as British people take pride.
Only indirectly.
So why can't we take guilt indirectly?
In terms of guilt, because you cannot be guilty for something you didn't do. You can be responsible for the effects. You can't be guilty for it.
But you can take pride in something you didn't do. But you can take pride in something you didn't do.
Metaphorically. So I prefer to use the word admiration now.
Okay, but most British people take pride in our win over the Nazis. Let's go to the audience here in the Conway Hall. Let's go to the lady in the third row.
Lord Biggar, you've spent much of your career arguing for moral clarity, Now that you've joined the House of Lords after getting peership by Cami Badenoch, the leader of the Conservative Party, do you worry that association might blur the lines between your academic voice and your political one?
Good question. Is that something you have to think about?
So I deliberately became politically committed. That doesn't mean to say that I've abandoned my mind or my conscience. When you're politically committed, you have to support things you don't entirely agree with. If I disagreed with something sufficiently, I could either abstain or resign, and I would. But it's part of the parliamentary game, if you like, that you have to commit yourself to a party. You don't agree with everything in the party. It doesn't matter which party you commit yourself to. But I think at this point in my life, I want to be committed rather than stand on the sidelines and spectate as an academic.
Would you describe yourself as a right-wing person?
No, I wouldn't, actually. I regard myself as a moderate person. People on the far left regard me as far right.
Well, some of your critics have pointed out that you spend a lot of time with kind of Viktor Orban-affiliated groups, and that's not a great look when you're talking about nationalism and history.
I absolutely reject any notion of damnation by association. I associate with all sorts of people. When I get to stand up on a platform that Viktor Orban may have shared in Washington, and I get to stand in London, you can be sure that I speak my mind, not his.
London and Washington, what about Budapest?
I mean, what's that got to do with... I mean, Viktor Orban lives in Budapest, what's that got to do with me?
You write in the book, in Colonial, you say, what has Viktor Orban got to do with me?
Yeah, exactly. What has it got to do with me?
Well, you launched your book at a Viktor Orban-funded think tank called the MCC in Budapest the year before.
The director of the MCC is not Viktor Orban.
The chair of the board.
It's Balos.
Yes.
Not Viktor.
He's the political director.
No connection.
No connection between Balos Orban and Viktor Orban?
No.
Balos Orban is the political director of Viktor Orban's prime ministerial office.
But it's not Viktor Orban.
I didn't say he was.
Right. So I mean, the MCC is an educational
It's funded by the Orban government. The New York Times has written many pieces about how it's linked to Orban.
There's much about the Orban government I disagree with. Okay. This project, I think, is very good.
But it's strange to write in the book, what has Viktor Orban got to do with me, when you'd literally spoken at an Orban-funded think tank alongside his political director?
I just wanted to make the point, when I step on a platform, I speak my mind, not anyone else's.
Fair enough. Okay, thank you for that. Let's go back to the audience. Let's go to the gentleman here in the front row.
We are focusing very much on how the empire is viewed in this country. But in countries like India, colonial institutions are regularly commemorated. These commemorations are fully reported in India by all their press, but they're completely ignored in this country. And I'm asking, why is it that commemorations are ignored in this country?
Is your point being that there are a lot of people in India who appreciate that colonial?
So, whereas they do in former colonies.
Well, I'm going to put that question, I'm suspecting Nigel might agree with you on that, so I'm going to put that question to Gurminder and say, do you want to respond that actually a lot of Indians appreciate what the British did?
I think Indians are probably the same as Brits in that they don't know their history very well. I mean, one of the things about British Empire is... I mean, so the arguments that have been made, we have to look at history seriously. And one of the things that's missing in the conversation and in the books is really this sense of connection between Britain and India and the ways in which India has funded so much of what exists within Britain. So slavery has contributed, but so has colonialism in India. And there's a failure to recognize the extent to which colonial and slave wealth has actually built every institution in this country that we're in. And I'd just like to say one other thing. One of the things that we talked about in terms of, stuff happens in the past and therefore we can't sort of address it in the present. Well, if we go to Edmund Burke and Edmund Burke's understanding of society, he understood society as a partnership between the living, the dead, and the not yet born. And the institutions are what combine the past, the present, and the future. And if there are injustices in institutions in the past, they manifest as inequalities in the present. So we have to address those inequalities in the present to make good the injustices of the past.
Okay, let's go back to the audience. Let's go to gentleman in the blue shirt, and then I'll go to the lady there. Gentleman there.
Given that the real rising empire in the world at the moment is China, and the role that they're playing with African countries, you talk about extracting materials, rare earth, the sort of Belt and Road Initiative, where they're effectively making other states indentured states. Who's going to be demanding reparations in 50 years' time, and from whom?
I'm going to put that question to Kojo, if you don't mind. Do you want to deal with that question?
This idea that the Belt and Road Initiative, countries engaging with China for development or engaging with Russia for security is a result of their own myopia and failure. I think we need to think about why is it that they're willing to engage with those countries but not willing to engage with Britain. The fact that we refuse to acknowledge the colonial violence, we refuse to offer a formal apology, and we refuse to recognise how damaging that history was. I think that we need to think about Britain's role of how do we re-establish those relationships with those countries.
We are almost out of time, but I did promise this lady here a question. You're going to be the last question. Apologies. Yeah.
Lord Biggar, you've argued that free speech is under threat from what you define as cancel culture. However, isn't that phrase often used to dismiss legitimate criticism? When does accountability for one's words stop being censorship and rather starts being responsibility?
So there's no doubt that the free expression of certain views like mine is cancelled. It's been cancelled, in my case, 3 times this year. I'm really glad that Mehdi has had the likes of me on this platform. I don't think there should be censorship within very broad legal confines. So the only way I can be accountable is by saying what I think, and then you can respond. That's why cancellation and censorship is so unhealthy, because views don't get challenged. We don't get to think together. And it's really important that we have more or less civilized exchanges where views that we really don't like, we get to be confronted with them and we get to be forced to think about them and discuss them. So I'm all in favour of accountability. I'm all in favour of free speech, except within confines imposed by the law in terms of forbidding the incitement to racial hatred, for example. But we should have a broad liberal space for the open, in good faith, exchange of ideas.
Well, I appreciate you letting me challenge your ideas tonight. We are out of time. Nigel Biggar, thank you for joining us on Head to Head. Thank you to our audience here in London's Conway Hall. Thank you for your questions, and thank you to our panel of experts for their insights. Appreciate you coming on the show. Head to Head is over for now, but it'll be back soon.